Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we'll be looking at CBSE Class 10 History Chapter 2, Nationalism in India. More specifically, we'll be learning about a very crucial topic in this chapter, which is non-cooperation movement versus civil disobedience movement. Now, I'm sure you're already well acquainted with these terms as they've appeared multiple times in your textbook. But through this video, I hope to provide a comprehensive overview and a deeper insight on the history and impact of these movements. We'll start by looking at the time frame of these movements. The non-cooperation movement was initiated in January of 1921 and it ended in February of 1922. And the civil disobedience movement started in March of 1930 and ended in March of 1931 through the Gandhi-Irwin Pact. We'll start with a timeline of the non-cooperation movement. It started in 1919 when the Imperial Legislative Council, which was the lawmaking body of India at the time, passed the Rowlatt Act. And despite apprehensions and strong dissent from the Indian members of this council, the act was passed, and it essentially empowered the British government to retain and arrest political prisoners for up to 2 years without a trial. So obviously this is unjust and against the principles of the judicial system, but it was a repressive technique used by the British to ensure that nationalist movements are nipped in the bud, or they're phased out in the early stages. Gandhi proposed a nationwide hartal, or a strike, against this act on April 6th of 1919. And it started as peaceful protests, but in due time, the British government began to respond with force by firing at peaceful protesting crowds. And on April 10th, General Dyer, who was a British general, entered the scene and he imposed a martial law. And a martial law requires all citizens to stay inside their houses at all times and avoid movement in and out. It's used to usher up all civil disobedience movements and keep people inside their houses. On April 13th, the infamous Jallianwalla Bagh Massacre took place, and we'll be looking at that in just a second. And eventually, after several months of thorough discussions within the Indian National Congress, the non-cooperation movement was formally adopted at the Nagpur session in 1920, and Nagpur is located in Maharashtra. So what is this Jallianwalla Bagh Massacre? Moments ago, I talked about the martial law, which prohibited people from leaving their houses. On April 13th of 1919, several villagers convened at the Jallianwalla Bagh grounds to celebrate the annual Baisakhi fair. And they were completely unaware that this martial law had been imposed, as they were living in the villages, which were relatively disconnected from the towns and cities. And without taking this fact into account, General Dyer ordered the British soldiers to open fire on a completely unaware, incognizant crowd, and that killed hundreds and injured several thousands. And this was the ultimate turning point of the entire movement. And this took place on April 13th, 1920, which is a day to remember in Indian history. The non-cooperation movement derived its principle from a book that was penned by Mahatma Gandhi, which was titled Hind Swaraj. And in this book, Gandhi put forward the ideology and belief that the British could only thrive in India on account of the cooperation that they received from Indians. And if Indians refused to cooperate, it would result in Swaraj, which is another word for freedom or liberation. So that was the belief and ideology behind the non-cooperation movement. and it unfolded in three primary stages. Initially, boycotting of British institutions took place. So doctors, lawyers, judges, and students left British institutions such as hospitals, courts, and schools. Next, the Indians surrendered any titles awarded by the British. And lastly, Indians picketed liquor shops, which means to block the entrance, and they began to promulgate the use of khadi cloth. And this was directly against import of mill-made, mass-produced, manufactured cloth, which was being imported from Britain. And so as a replacement, people began to use khadi cloth, which was manufactured by hand, spun by hand in Indian hand looms. So this was a win-win situation because on one hand, you're actively opposing the British, and on the other hand, the local small businessmen that produced khadi cloth had a boost in their sales. So it allowed them to reap some profits. However, this did not last long for a few reasons. There was no Indian institution that was set up in place of British institutions. So in a few months, the students, doctors, and lawyers slowly began trickling back into the British institutions. And the khadi cloth is very expensive because it's not mass-produced. And middle classes couldn't afford this much longer. So they had to revert back to the mill-made cloth which is imported from Britain. Also, diverse groups of society began to perceive the movement differently. For example, the tenants of small land perceived the movement as an opportunity to revolt against the landowners, and tribals had a different cause. They wanted to push towards opening reserved forests so that they can meet their daily needs, such as grazing their cattle. And the peasants that worked in the tea estates, they thought that Swaraj meant being allowed to move back to their hometown for a few days, because the Inland Immigration Act of 1859 prohibited them from doing so. They had to stay within the limits of their tea estate or their plantation for years. So with these different perceptions, the idea of Swaraj couldn't find a unified cause, and people began to digress from the ultimatum of the movement. So eventually it fizzled out, and it also started turning violent in places because the tribals, peasants, and plantation workers were violently revolting or creating uproar against the British government, which was completely against the ideology that Gandhi put forward, which is non-violence. So in February of 1922, Gandhi decided to call off the movement because he decided that the satyagrahis had to be properly trained and that the movement had to take a more unified cause, and also that all these diverse groups had to be brought under the same umbrella of national independence. So now let's look at a timeline of the civil disobedience movement. In 1928, the Simon Commission was appointed by the new Tory government in Britain. And the purpose of the Simon Commission was to look into the constitutional functioning of India and suggest a few changes. However, the one pitfall of this commission was that Indian representation was literally zero. There was not a single Indian member. And this obviously caused dissent among the Indians, and they began to chant, "Go back, Simon," because they obviously didn't want the Simon Commission here. So in 1920, to pacify or neutralize the issue, Viceroy Irwin made a proposal and invited Gandhi to the first roundtable conference in London. And he proposed a vague dominion status which entitled India to being autonomous but still being allegiant to the crown or the British government. And obviously the radicals and revolutionaries strike down this idea immediately, and in 1930 they took a pledge for Purna Swaraj, or complete independence. And in 1930 Gandhi also wrote a list of demands in a letter which he wrote to Viceroy Irwin. And these were 11 demands, and each demand catered to a different group of society. For example, one of the demands was related to the businessmen. One of them was linked to the tribals. But one key demand in this list was a demand to abolish the salt tax. And this was truly a unifying element because salt was used abundantly by the poor man and the rich man alike. And so this brought people together because salt tax was, according to Gandhi, the most oppressive face of the British. And Gandhi stated that if these 11 demands weren't met by March of 1930, then they would commence a full civil disobedience movement. And obviously, Viceroy Irwin did not comply with these demands, and the civil disobedience movement was initiated through the Salt March. And since all of these events took place in 1930, the specific month, the pledge for Purna Swaraj, or the unofficial Independence Day, was on January 26, 1930. Gandhi wrote his list of demands in March of 1930, and the Salt March began on March 12th of 1930. So the turning point of this civil disobedience movement was obviously the Simon Commission. And as you can see in this visual, people hoisted flags and chanted, "Simon, go back." So the difference here was brought by the Salt March. And so through the civil disobedience movement, it was an enhanced version of the non-cooperation movement. So people were still refusing to cooperate with the British, as it was the fundamental ideology put forward by Gandhi. But they were also simultaneously breaking colonial laws intentionally. So they're displaying their unlawfulness through the civil disobedience movement. And the first stage of the movement, as I mentioned earlier, began with the Salt March. So Gandhi walked from Sabarmati to a coastal town in Gujarat called Dundee, and this distance was around 240 kilometers. He traveled 24 kilometers per day on foot, so it took approximately 10 days. And during this time, he mobilized popular support. He spread the ideals of Swaraj to the disconnected areas or marginalized sections of society, and he began to gain. He toured extensively, obviously 240 kilometers, and through this he was also able to endorse or promote the civil disobedience movement. And through this he garnered more supporters, and the movement became stronger by the day. Eventually he reached the coastal town of Dundee, and he broke the first colonial law, which was manufacturing salt by boiling seawater. And this sparked the civil disobedience movement. However, this movement had a quick downfall as well. The British government, as usual, retaliated with violence. They began firing at peaceful crowds. And eventually, the Gandhi-Irwin Pact of 1931 was signed, and the movement was seized. And Gandhi was invited to participate in the second roundtable conference in London, as the Congress boycotted the first one. And after the conference, Gandhi was disappointed, as he felt that the conference didn't result in any paradigm shift or change in the Indian independence movement. So there's a resurgence of the movement, but eventually it fizzled out by 1934 because several of the groups that participated in the first phase of the movement were hesitant and skeptical to resume participation in the second part, which was in 1932 to 1934. So eventually both of these movements, non-cooperation and civil disobedience, fizzled out, they ended, but one thing's for sure, they promoted the idea of India as a nation, as an independent nation, and they also spread a wide resentment against the British Empire. And this helped mobilize national sentiment and national feeling, which would aid in the final stages of the Indian national movement. And this is a very significant topic, and there's a guaranteed 3-mark or 2-mark question in the board exam based on this. So the question could be framed as differentiate between civil disobedience and non-cooperation. How can you approach this question? Let's look at a topper's answer. This person wrote, the civil disobedience movement and non-cooperation movement were two major turning points in the struggle for independence. However, they had a few subtle differences. The non-cooperation movement was initiated based on a belief put forward by Gandhi that the British could only thrive in India with cooperation from the indigenous population, and that refusal to cooperate would result in Swaraj, or freedom. The civil disobedience movement was an enhanced version of the NCM, wherein Indians would refuse to cooperate and also intentionally infringe colonial laws. Example, manufacturing salt from seawater. The movement unfolded identically, in other words, or as in, picketing liquor shops, boycotting British institutions. So this answer provided the correct definition. It provided the correct differences between the two movements, and the presentation was also excellent because the answer was enlisted in 4 points. Handwriting was neat. So I'd give this answer a 3 out of 3. So obviously this is a significant topic, and this is how you should frame your answers. So that concludes this video, which was differentiating between civil disobedience movement and non-cooperation movement. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great learning experience. And until the next video, Nishal Tube signing off. Peace.